your book. The book, again, that Rick has coming out is called History of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn. It is coming out July 11th. You can find it on Amazon. It's listed on Amazon for $23.99. There it is. It's a pretty substantial book. It's about 250 pages. It's pretty in depth on the history of the Nets. But that's just my word from it. Let's hear from the author. Go ahead.
So my take on this is the story behind this is the nomadic Nets. That's kind of the theme of the book, is that they played in 8 different arenas. They started in Teaneck, New Jersey, playing at the Teaneck Armory in front of basically what would have amounted to a high school gymnasium with, a smattering of fans. And ultimately what we saw in Brooklyn during the height of this new era Big Three, was playoff games. Was, of course, maybe a size 16 shoe instead of a size 18 shoe going to the Eastern Conference Finals a couple years ago. But when you look at the history of this team, they really have never had a city or an arena wrap its arms around them and say, we're calling you our team. We're going to support you. They've never had the financial stability. They've never had ownership stability. Moving to Brooklyn in 2012, 2013 was supposed to represent their now permanent home after the Los Angeles Dodgers had left in 1957. Talk about, I'll put myself in the mix when watching the New Jersey Nets growing up, going to the Meadowlands, and even, for my family going before that to the RAC and Rutgers and et cetera. There was some heartbreak for New Jersey fans because they felt like moving to Brooklyn was going to be, might as well move to Madagascar. Well, that was only a 13-mile move that they took. With traffic, it's a lot longer and a lot more difficult and a lot more headaches. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Dodgers, when they moved out to LA, not only were Brooklynites heartbroken, but there wasn't even an opportunity to take a train or a bus or anything to go see their team. It was thousands and thousands of miles on the opposite side of the country. So when the Nets came back to Brooklyn, it was a feel-good story for Brooklynites. But the problem was there were already well-established Knicks fans that had been in the city for many generations. The point of moving the team to Brooklyn was almost an afterthought to Bruce Ratner and his Forest City Ratner real estate development. It was almost as though he bought the team just so he could see through his real estate deal and then wash his hands of it. And that's ultimately what ended up happening. And then we know the first version of the Big Three that crashed and burned with Mikhail Prokhorov, when he went all in and tried to get Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce and Jason Terry, and that crashed and burned. And then once he basically declared within 5 years of ownership, we're going to win a championship, but that didn't happen. What did he do? He got up and sold the team and moved all his assets from Russia over to the U.S. and cashed out, and the rest was history. So, it's funny because you look at 55 years later and you think the Nets are in such a better, much more stable ownership situation and in a permanent home, or so they say. But then you read reports now of how the team's hemorrhaging money, that, now with no big box office names on the roster, you wonder what the future holds for this team in Brooklyn. And ultimately, like I said, history has a way of repeating itself. So who knows? Part 2 could be from Teaneck to Brooklyn, back to Teaneck again, or to Timbuktu. I can't even predict where the next chapter of Nets history is going to be in the next 5 or 10 years.
I always felt that the Nets should have, a long time ago, before they built Barclays Center, before they moved to Brooklyn, they should have they should have stayed and moved and stayed, for that matter, in Newark. I thought that was a brilliant idea for them to go there. I mean, the city loves basketball. It's an inner city. It would do a great thing for a lot of the youth there to have a professional basketball team in the city of Newark. And I thought that was a missed opportunity. I know, that arena is a beautiful arena that the Devils have. I know the Nets were there for a short period of time, obviously, when they were making that transition from Continental Airlines Arena to the Barclays Center. But to me, that was an opportunity missed. I think if they had stayed there, I think it would have been, I don't know if I would say it was the word gold mine, but I think it would have benefited the franchise and a fan base that's here in New Jersey so much more. I think it really would have made a nice connection there. And for some reason, it's, like you mentioned, it's hard for New Yorkers to all of a sudden connect to the Nets because they think, oh, wait, the Nets, New Jersey, that's what, if they only have the Knicks, they're the criminal creme in New York. That's tough to do. And if let's say they get up and move again, what do you do with that arena, especially with the Islanders now having moved back to the Long Island and Belmont? So that there's another problem there. It's amazing. It really is an amazing situation.
And there were so many fascinating stories. I talked to Michael Rowe, who of course was president of the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority. He was also president of the Nets in 1995. And he talked about all these different scenarios where there was a scenario where the Nets were going to share MSG with the Knicks. but they couldn't find basically between, all the shows and the Knicks games and Nets games, they couldn't make it work logistically. There was a scenario that basically there was a signed deal to go back to be sold to Charles Wong and go back to Long Island where it all started. That deal fell through because they had the Secaucus 7, a very complicated ownership situation where not all 11 owners were on board. And then the whole thing about trying to find a one arena solution for the Devils and for the Nets, when the Nets, of course, Ray Chambers wanted to move the team to Newark, and the Devils ultimately actually wanted to build an arena in Hoboken. And when they went to try to go do that, Christy Whitman at the time basically said, I can't sell that. I can't sell that to taxpayers, and you need to come up with a one arena solution. And ultimately, it was the Devils that ended up kind of adopting that blueprint that Ray Chambers had, because he was involved with both the Nets and the Devils, and moving to Newark. And when the Nets ultimately, they were in financial straits and Bruce Ratner got into the picture, they ultimately started forging this path to Brooklyn. And that's where things kind of split off. And that 2-year, I'll call it a pit stop, because that's really what it was. Yeah. A 2-year pit stop at the Prudential Center was an absolute nightmare. I mean, I talked to some of the high up people in the marketing executives that worked when Prokhorov stepped in those last couple of years in New Jersey, and then of course Brooklyn. And it was a nightmare trying to sell season tickets to a fan base that knew this team was not going to be there for the long term. Yep. Half in, half, 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out. It was just a very difficult scenario. And even the first few years in Brooklyn, trying to promote, they tried to bury the Nets brand. It was all about Brooklyn, even on the court and the logo and the jerseys. Nowhere did you see a Nets shield up until probably the last 5 or 6 years, or Nets lettering. It was all about trying to be a lifestyle brand instead of honoring the tradition of this franchise that, let's face it, they've had more disappointing and embarrassing moments than they've had good, but it's still a 55-year history that spans generations. And they did a very poor job of honoring that in the early Brooklyn years. And I can't fault them at the end of New Jersey Nets days, because what else are they going to do? They were already the move to Brooklyn was already 8 years in the making. They were talking about it in 2004. It finally happened in 2012. And their last game at the Meadowlands was that 12-70 season, the most forgettable of all games you could ever imagine. It was just leaving New Jersey on an ultimate low, leaving the Meadowlands on an ultimate low, and then leaving Newark on an ultimate low. Just left a bitter taste in a lot of New Jerseyans' mouths for sure.
It really did. And you mentioned Nets history, recent history, of course. Isn't that bad for the Nets? I mean, ever since, certainly since the turn of the century, it's been actually pretty good. I mean, the team has been to the NBA Finals a couple of times. They've been to the playoffs, more than a half dozen times. Obviously, the Jason Kidd era, even the Darren Williams era, getting there a couple of times with Kidd, ironically, as the head coach. So there has been good moments over the last couple of decades, and it's a shame that ownership has bungled it in so many ways and so many facets, that we've already described. But the biggest being not being able to find an identity and embrace an identity and a home, for that matter. That's the one that really bugs me.
Yeah, and they're not doing much to ingratiate themselves to this fan base, because, again, they did a deal with the Devil. It was championship or bust expectations for now the second time in not even 10 years, in 7 years. So how much heartbreak can fans take? And the New Jersey Net fans that are going to read this book, the hardcore fans, follow this team from, let's say, even going back to Nassau Coliseum, the ABA days, they will be there. They have the battle scars, and they're not going anywhere. It's the new age fans that like the Nets because of Kevin Durant, and like the Nets, dare I say, because of Kyrie Irving or James Harden. And now all of a sudden they've seen everything that fell apart. It's almost that the new class of fans, and that being, let's just call it the 28, 21 and under crowd, they root almost more for the player than they do for the team. And now that the Nets have had a big soap opera and an ugly divorce, it looks like, with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, I just wonder how this is going to be received publicly. The optics aren't good. This was not all on Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. This was botched all around. This was a collaborative team effort in the worst way to make this thing go sideways. So again, having studied and lived through a lot of the history of this team, I see some dark days ahead for the Nets. I still think they can be a playoff caliber team, but anytime you have a perennial superstar and probably one of the greatest players in the history of the NBA demand to leave your team, that can have a long-lasting impact on a franchise and really scare away a lot of future free agents.
Really good. So again, we've only got a couple seconds, Rick. Again, author of History of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn. Again, it's on Amazon. Just quickly before you go, where else could people find this book if they want to get hands on it?
Sure. If you want to follow, we have a good growing community of Nets fans on Facebook. It's at Nets Insider. We have about 1,000 fans that are of the hardcore variety, seen the good, seen the highs, seen the lows. You can order it by sending a direct message on at Nets Insider or at Nets History on Twitter. I'm doing autographed copies that I'll send directly to you for $30. Very easy process. So like I said, I know this seems like it's always darkest before the dawn. Sometimes you don't realize how bad things were until those people that were inside the building causing the problems leave. And I'm not saying that Sean Marks isn't at fault, but at the end of the day, I think the Nets can come out the other side of this, but everybody's got to just put those championship hopes aside, at least for a couple more years.
Couple more years. Oh, well, at least we have the Mets. Oh, wait, as long as no one's hurt, for that matter.
I almost said Happy Bobby Bonilla Day, right?
Exactly. Happy Bobby Bonilla Day, everybody. There you
I almost forgot. You know what, Michael? Who knows? Like I said, knowing the zany history, maybe Steve Cohen will say, you know what, I'm going to fix the Nets. I'll buy them too.
Maybe the Nets can defer payments to Kevin Durant so they can have Happy Bobby Bonilla / Kevin Durant Day
in perpetuity, right?
Exactly.
June 30th.
Oh my God, June 30th, a day to avoid. If you
right,
that's for sure.
They can make that National Not Go to Work Day in honor of Kyrie Irving.
Oh man! All right, Rick, awesome stuff. Again, folks, history of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn. Rick said, go to Nets Insider to find out more. Insider.com, also his Facebook page, and also Amazon.com has copies of the book as well. So, Rick, thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.